Welcome to the fourth episode of the Kristen Supercript Molestic Ringside Report Show. We're recording today on the 19th anniversary of the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center Twin Towers. And I want to first acknowledge the tremendous loss that Americans across the country are feeling today at the over 2,900 people that were killed on this day 19 years ago. I know I speak for all the staff and feature writers for Ringside Report in mourning the tragic loss of those lives. On a brighter note, I am honored to bring a very special guest to my show today, a man who has made it his life's work to fight for justice in America, Kirschner. Joined here today by Kirschner, who has 30 years of experience as a federal prosecutor and is an NBC and MSNBC legal analyst. He has his own YouTube show and podcast called Justice Matters, which I'm subscribed to. And if you're not already, you should definitely subscribe yourself right now. Like this minute, go to his show, hit the subscribe button, and then come back and watch my interview with him. But welcome, Ben, and thank you so much for being on my show today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So, Ben, rather than reading off a list of all of your accomplishments and experiences and sounding like a Wikipedia entry, can you give us the highlights of your personal and professional background and how you came to be where you are today?
Sure. So I was born in Brooklyn. I grew up a gutter kid in New Jersey. My pop was a high school football coach and a wrestling coach and a boxer. He was a heck of a boxer, and he was also an All-American football player at Montclair State. He instilled in me a love of boxing. So I am nothing but a ham and egger. But, you know, I grew up going to the heavyweight championship fights on closed circuit TV at Madison Square Garden with my pop, at the Garden State Arts Center on the New Jersey, on the Garden State Parkway. So I am a huge boxing fan. But so I went to Point Pleasant Borough High School, graduated in '79. I was a wrestler and a football player myself. Went on to Washington and Lee University, where I played football. I was also ROTC undergrad, so I entered active duty with the U.S. Army. But first, I put myself through law school. I took an educational deferment of my active duty time after I graduated from Washington and Lee, put myself through law school, got my law degree, and I entered active duty as a U.S. Army JAG in January of 1988. I served about 6.5 years on active duty. My first tour was in Anchorage, Alaska, at Fort Richardson, the 6th Infantry Division, where I prosecuted court-martial cases. And then I was transferred to an assignment in Falls Church, Virginia, at the U.S. Army Legal Services Agency, where I was a prosecutor in the appellate courts. So after soldiers were convicted at court-martial, if they appealed their conviction, I would be the prosecutor in the appellate courts. After about 6.5 years, I left active duty because the Army essentially promotes its JAGs out of the courtroom at the 6 or 7 year mark. And I was not ready to leave the courtroom. In fact, turned out I was never ready to leave the courtroom. So I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, which is in the Department of Justice. My first boss, the person who gave me an opportunity to be a federal prosecutor, was Eric Holder, who was then the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. Of course, he went on to be President Obama's Attorney General. And then I had some more good fortune because after being a federal prosecutor for a couple of years in that office, I was asked to come to the homicide section, and the chief of homicide at that time was Bob Mueller, who went on to become special counsel. So I learned how to be a federal homicide prosecutor from Bob Mueller, and he was the single best supervisor I ever worked for. I would go on to become chief of the homicide section a few years after Bob left. So I ended up being responsible for all murder prosecutions in the courts of Washington, D.C. I had about between 27 and 30 homicide prosecutors that I supervised. So after a little over 30 years total as a federal prosecutor, first in the Army and then in the Department of Justice, I retired. I had the good fortune again to be asked to try out as a legal analyst on MSNBC. I actually retired on June 1st of 2018. On June 2nd, MSNBC put me on a train from Union Station in DC up to 30 Rockefeller Center, and they put me on air 9 times in 3 days. And it was either sink or swim. And I think I took on some water, but I managed to swim. And I became a formal MSNBC, NBC News legal analyst, and have been doing that ever since. When COVID hit and the focus became more sort of medical analysts, doctors, and nurses who we see on TV quite a bit now, I decided to start my own YouTube channel, and it really has taken off in a very gratifying way. So I post one video every day about whatever illegality is going on in the Trump administration, whatever the day's abuse of the rule of law by Bill Barr is, or Mike Pompeo. I try to do a video about it and break it down in layman's terms to give people information they can understand and incorporate into their own, political decisions about how they want to vote in the upcoming election. So I do that. I do a podcast called Justice Matters. I still appear on MSNBC. I'm scheduled to appear tomorrow morning, the early shift at 6 a.m. I'll be on. And so, yeah, this is a professional chapter 2 for me, and it's been nothing I ever expected, but it's a very gratifying professional chapter 2.
That's amazing. And that you're still as busy as you are, even after all you've already accomplished. I know there was a movie made about one of your trials, Georgetown, that was made last year. But what of all of the major cases that you've prosecuted was the most memorable or interesting to you?
Yeah, there are so many. I prosecuted, I tried more than 50 murder cases, but I handled hundreds and hundreds of murder cases, both in local superior court and in federal district court, where I tried RICO cases that were seemingly endless. I was in trial for 6 months in a murder-driven RICO case. I was in a trial in another RICO case for 3 months. I mean, they are very long, grueling propositions, but nobody said justice was going to be easy. I don't have a favorite case. I would say, my favorite part of being a homicide prosecutor was helping families who lost a loved one to violent crime. Mm-hmm. Because if you imagine one day your son or your daughter, your spouse, your sibling, your parent doesn't come home unexpectedly, is lost to violent crime, your family is never the same. And then you're injected into this strange world of police investigations and court proceedings and prosecutions and sentencing hearings. And I got to work with those families. For 22 years, I was a homicide prosecutor, 22 of my 30 years. So I have hundreds and hundreds of homicide families that will always just sort of live and reside in my heart. I stay in contact with so many of them even now. And so that was my favorite part about being a homicide prosecutor. The Georgetown case was very interesting. Christoph Waltz made a movie about it. There's a case called Robert Wan. That was a very interesting case. But, each case is special in its own way, mainly because of the victim, the family members, and the witnesses that I get to know when I undertake to investigate, indict, and try a murder case. So every day was interesting.
That's awesome that you're also making such a difference in people's lives and bringing them comfort when you were doing that too. There are some fictional TV shows that involve trial law that I really enjoy. One of them is The Good Fight. It's one of my favorite shows. I'm sure that TV shows sensationalize law quite a bit. But I was wondering, are there any that you actually have been able to enjoy without feeling completely ridiculous?
Yeah, the CSI type shows became the bane of our existence because, people would watch those shows and see, all of this magical law enforcement stuff that goes on, and everything gets wrapped up in a nice little bow in 45 minutes. And then they come to expect that of our prosecutions. And I can tell you, prosecuting murder cases is messy. Nothing ever fits together the way it does on TV. I will say, I read a lot of crime fiction. I'm a bit of a crime fiction junkie. That whether it's the George Pelicanos or Walter Mosley or Michael Connelly or Robert Craze, I love all of that. I didn't really gravitate toward the TV crime fiction. You know what? One of my favorite crime shows ever, though, was NYPD Blue, with the Andy Sipowitzes and the great characters, the lead characters that would come and go through that program. That was one of my favorite sort of police procedural shows.
Interesting. And one thing I really love about your show and your podcast, Justice Matters, is that you do explain law in layman's terms, so that even those with zero legal experience can understand it. And you talk about real practical solutions to today's issue. Just yesterday, you discussed how Trump's downplaying, aka lies, to the American public about the threat of COVID-19 meets the legal criteria of at least involuntary manslaughter or negligent homicide, and at most murder too. My experience with legal processes, though much more limited than yours, was teaching and enforcing Michigan mental health code, a state law, as a recipient rights trainer and specialist working in public mental health. So in this role, we investigated complaints of everything from dignity and respect violations, the type of which, if Trump was a caregiver or a caseworker or anyone providing services to people who receive public mental health services in Michigan, would violate almost every time he opened his mouth, all the way up to the highest offenses of abuse and neglect. The worst one is abuse 1, which is defined as, quote, a non-accidental act or provocation of another to act by an employee, volunteer, or agent of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, which caused or contributed to the death and sexual abuse of or serious physical harm to a recipient, close quote. So when Donald Trump downplayed and compared COVID-19 to the seasonal flu and discouraged wearing masks and encouraged reopening of businesses before it was safe to do so, that was a non-accidental provocation of others to act in a way that contributed to the death and serious physical harm to hundreds of thousands of Americans. If he was a caregiver making as little as $9.65 an hour, he'd be fired from that job. And yet this man holds the highest office in the land and gets away with the worst transgressions imaginable, time and time again. People who help others like me with their daily needs, like getting out of bed every day and taking showers and are making pennies for it, are held to a higher standard for their work than the President of the United States. How, in your own words, could you account for this kind of discrepancy?
So, it's interesting that you raise that, because what I don't think people appreciate is Donald Trump's conduct violates the laws of all 50 states in any number of ways, right? I do think he has homicide liability for so much of what he's done, even before Bob Woodward released the tapes proving that he lied and endangered the lives of the American people in a way that to most people is unfathomable. I mean, he literally could have told us early on how deadly this disease is, how it's airborne, how easily it's transmitted from person to person. And back in January, he could have said, all we need to do to protect ourselves is wear masks all the time, and we wouldn't be breathing it in. We wouldn't run the risk of infection, but he lied to us about it. That violates, I am quite confident, the laws of all 50 states. So when Donald Trump leaves office, I wish it would happen even sooner, but I don't know that it will. All 50 states are going to have to investigate, present evidence to their grand juries, if that's the system they have for indicting people, and seek indictments for Donald Trump and all of his co-conspirators, all of his aiders and abettors, all of his accessories, because there is criminal liability beyond Donald Trump here. When you look at Mike Pence, who was the head of the coronavirus task force, and we now know he stood idly by while Donald Trump lied to the American people, endangered our lives, and caused needless deaths. Mike Pence has responsibility for that as well, as do so many others in the federal government. And you know, the intersection of mental health law and the criminal justice system is also something that is, one, fascinating to me, and two, an area where I think we really need to retool what we do, because I think we treat people in the criminal justice system as if they don't necessarily have mental health challenges. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a mistake and an opportunity lost. I do think if we spent more time really evaluating and diagnosing the mental health problems that people who come in contact with the criminal justice system have and treat them accordingly, we would do a lot better by people, and we would actually end up saving resources in the long run if we could get people the mental health help they need. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a defense attorney who specializes in this area. And, you know, when people are sentenced to incarceration, they really get almost no mental health evaluation or treatment. And guess what? When they go into the system, they end up suffering and coming out with PTSD, even if they didn't have it going in. And we really don't focus on the mental health challenges and responsibilities, I would say, that we have to people who we take into custody. So it's a longer conversation, but you know, that is an area that I think we need to focus on beginning in January in a Biden administration, and do better by people who come in contact with the criminal justice system.
I absolutely agree. And I didn't write a question about that or anything, but I'm really glad that you brought up that point. My background is in social work. That's what my master's degree was in. And a lot of my education was based on the intersection between the criminal justice system and the public mental health system. And the intersect points at which if there was more interaction, more collaboration, so many people could be being treated and rehabilitated versus being incarcerated. So I appreciate you elaborating on that a little bit. My next question, a lot of people are worried that in the current political climate, voting is not going to be enough. Do you think it will be? And what words of comfort could you offer to skeptics if you do?
I think, notwithstanding all of Donald Trump's efforts to interfere in the elections, he has invited foreign interference from both Russia and from China. If you'll remember, he stood up on the White House lawn and said, I think China ought to investigate my opponent, Joe Biden, as well. He has installed a postmaster general whose sole mission seems to be to slow the mail down, to interfere in mail-in ballots. So Donald Trump is doing everything he can. I think he tweeted something out about how he wants to send his army to the polls to be poll watchers, obviously to intimidate voters. He's pulling out all the stops. Why? Because he's desperate and he knows that he's going to lose in a landslide. I take great comfort in the 2018 midterm results, because we as the American people, we were abused by our government, you know, to a pretty significant extent when we went to the polls in 2018, and 41 seats flipped to the Democrats in the House of Representatives. But whereas we were abused this much by Donald Trump and company in 2018, we have now been abused this much. So can you imagine the numbers that will be driven to the polls by what Donald Trump and his band of criminals have done to us? I believe that notwithstanding all of Donald Trump's nefarious efforts to interfere in the election, people are going to walk through fire and crawl over broken glass to get to the polls and to vote against Donald Trump and for Joe Biden in unprecedented numbers. I say we need to vote in numbers too big to rig, because he's going to try to rig it, but we're going to vote in numbers too big to rig, and Donald Trump will be on his way. Now, what he does between November and January is anybody's guess, and we better hold on tight. A lot of people have been asking recently, well, what about if he issues pardons to everybody and then he steps down before the end of his term so that Mike Pence becomes president and Pence pardons him? That's what my YouTube video is about today, which I'll be posting this evening. And I take on the legal issues of why that will not work. So, you know what? As long as we're willing to take the fight to Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, and the rest of the merry band of criminals, Bill Barr, the American people are going to win.
That's another reason I love watching your show, is because you always end on those notes of hope, and it really helps me a lot with my mental health these days. You know, I'm immunocompromised, I have muscular dystrophy, and it's just been a really terrifying time to be living in. And so this election, never has an election meant so much to me in my lifetime. But my next question, while you have proposed most charges against Trump beginning in January 2021, after he will, fingers crossed, be voted out of office, you've also proposed some very logical and achievable legal charges that could be brought against others in the Trump orbit, starting right now. For example, in your show, you talked about Louis DeJoy being culpable under state law in North Carolina for asking employees to donate to Republican candidates and then reimbursing them, which is an illegal practice. Do you think most legal charges on a state or federal level are likely to happen before Trump is voted out of office, or do you think that these processes will be more likely halted or delayed until after he's no longer able to manipulate the proceedings?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Realistically, I think most states, state prosecutors, attorneys general are probably waiting until the election to begin dropping criminal charges, assuming they have enough evidence. Now, when I was discussing the Louis DeJoy crimes, which, even Louis DeJoy's own former director of HR said on the record, and he was not an anonymous source, he told the Washington Post, our boss, Louis DeJoy, pressured us to make campaign contributions to Republicans of his choosing, and then he reimbursed us. He asked us for money, we gave him money, and then he reimbursed us. He gave us bonuses. That's a campaign finance violation under not only federal law, but the laws of North Carolina. And in North Carolina, there is no statute of limitations, and those are felony offenses. Now, it seems to me that the state of North Carolina, assuming they have conducted any sort of investigation based on the Washington Post reporting, they probably have enough evidence to satisfy the arrest standard for Louis DeJoy right now, which is probable cause. It is a relatively low standard by which we seek arrest indictments or arrest warrants for people. I wish that the attorney general or the district attorney who is responsible for the jurisdiction in which Louis DeJoy committed these crimes when he was CEO of New Breed Logistics, I wish they would get an arrest warrant for him right now. Because if they have the evidence to charge him now, why in the world would they wait? Not that you do it because you want to have him removed as Postmaster General. You do it because you have evidence of the crime and you have a responsibility to do it now, rather than wait for some artificial deadline like November or January. So I wish the states would begin moving out. Would they come under attack, and would Bill Barr swoop in and make a supremacy clause argument whether or not the supremacy clause covered this? Of course he's going to do it. We saw what he just did to E. Jean Carroll, right? So, but that's not an excuse to you never decline to do the right thing for fear of how the wrong people will react. And Bill Barr is the wrong person because he's a lawless attorney general. They should be moving out on state charges right now, in my opinion.
Absolutely, I agree. And I didn't have this in my questions, but as we're talking and I'm just thinking about it, I see that a lot of people think that all politicians are dirty, all politicians can't be trusted. But I feel like there's such a huge difference between somebody having things that, on their agenda that maybe don't align with many in the public eye, from blatant illegal criminal activity. Did you ever, in your wildest dreams, imagine an administration with as much corruption and illegal criminal activity as you've seen the last 3.5 years?
No, because there used to be checks and balances. So if executive branch officials, cabinet members, for example, committed crimes, the Department of Justice was responsible for investigating those crimes and holding criminal members of the executive branch accountable for those crimes. But we have no checks and balances right now because we have a Department of Justice headed up by Bill Barr that absolutely refuses to hold Donald Trump or any of his cabinet members accountable for their crimes. Not to mention, if you move over to the legislative branch, because Donald Trump and the executive branch will not comply with lawfully issued congressional subpoenas, that's another check and balance that no longer exists. Congress can't do anything. Bill Barr won't do anything. And the courts, which remain strong, and the judges continue to rule against Donald Trump at every turn, they are a reactive branch of government. Judges, the judiciary, can't reach out and fix problems. All they can do is receive cases that come to them and try to handle them in accordance with the rule of law. So they're not an effective check and balance until some issue or some case comes to them. So right now, Donald Trump and the executive branch are unconstrained. They are allowed to just run wild and run lawless because neither Bill Barr nor the legislative branch can or will do anything about it.
Yeah. And for my last question, and this is a little intense, so I apologize in advance. But in the current political climate, during the Black Lives Matter movement, a hugely disproportionate number of Black and people of color in prison, and an unprecedented time of corruption coming out of the White House and the executive branch. A lot of people have lost faith in our criminal justice system. Do you believe that the system is broken? And if so, do you have hope that it can be repaired?
I think the system is badly damaged. And I think criminal justice reform has never been fully tackled. We tinker around the edges, but as a prosecutor for 30 years on the inside of the system, I've seen where the weak spots are. I've seen where the unfairness is. And it's something that I think we need to tackle beginning in January. And I'm confident that a Biden-Harris administration will take it on. I think policing, first and foremost, needs to be reformed. This coming from a guy who worked with thousands of police officers across all of the federal and local in the DMV area, the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia area. And I have great respect for so many of the police officers. But, you know, when there are a few bad police officers, it ruins it for everybody. And, you know, frankly, there are more than a few bad police officers. So I think it all starts with police reform, because police officers and agents and detectives and investigators are the ones who are out in the community setting the tone for how the community will view law enforcement, how they will perceive their government. Will they perceive it to be fair, or will they perceive it to be unfair, biased against the underclass, against minorities? And, you know, the problem is, if there's a perception of unfairness, that hurts the integrity of the system, and it hurts the way the citizens will view the system. You know, the problem right now that I see, there have been so many instances of excessive force by police that it can't be that we just tinker around the edges by saying we have to ban chokeholds or we have to ban the use of a particular weapon. Because if just putting bans in place worked, then we already wouldn't have the kind of abuses we see. We need to move beyond these sort of minor reforms. I have proposed in a number of videos and podcasts, we need a sea change in policing that I think is imminently doable. What we need is full citizen participation in the hiring and vetting process of police officers, in the training and testing process of police officers, and in the accountability process once police officers are alleged to have engaged in excessive force. Because it's only with full citizen participation across the whole spectrum of policing that we can really build that contract, that covenant between the community and the police that will serve both parties well. Tinkering around the edges and banning chokeholds is not a remedy. Full citizen participation in policing is a remedy. So that's a very shorthand version of what is an hour topic that I've talked about before, and how, you know, police reform is doable. We just have to have the political will to take it on.
Ben, thank you so much, not only for coming on the show and sharing with me today, but for everything that you're doing, for doing your show, Justice Matters. I really think that you're giving people a lot of hope and clarity during a time that's been very difficult. So I just wanted to make sure I told you that, and we're all set. So thanks again.
Well, thank you. It was a great interview, good questions. And I know you said this was your first interview, but that was terrific.
Thank you. You take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.